Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here to Berlin. I'm deeply grateful to the organizers of the conference, to the organizational committee, and especially to my advisor, Stephen Asheim. All the panelists this morning, Arik, Adi, and I, were Stephen's students, Mosse's grandchildren, and we are very proud students. I would also like to thank John Totorici, of course, the spirit of the Mosse Program, and Sky Donny, whose devotion to the Mosse Program is the main reason why we are here together in this great city, beginning to wrap up such a unique and interesting conference. I would also like to dedicate my talk to my biological grandfather, Benjamin Benno Kestenbaum Armon, who was born in Berlin in 1918, the same year as Mosse, and died in Jerusalem in 2000, a few months after Mosse's death. They were born in the same city, but lived in very different neighborhoods. They were, in fact, brothers and strangers, separated by culture, tradition, belief, and millions of Reichsmarks. My grandfather worked in Yad Vashem for more than 3 decades, bridging the gap between German and Jews. He accompanied official visits of Adenauer, Brandt, and many others in Yad Vashem, and in 1996 received a special award from Johannes Rau a few years before Rau was nominated as President of Germany. My grandfather dreamed all of his life of becoming a theater actor or director. Eventually, he found himself directing the Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Day state ceremony at Yad Vashem. I mentioned brothers and strangers, like the title of Stephen's book, but we will start today's talk with another book he wrote, which I like even better, The Nietzsche Legacy in Germany, 1890-1990. And in the book, Stephen examines the intellectual reception of Nietzsche, whether filtered through sentiments of hostility, admiration, or ambivalence. And one of Nietzsche's harshest critics during the end of the 19th century, mentioned by Stephen, was Max Nordau, our main protagonist today. And like in Stephen's book, we will cover the period of more or less 100 years, from 1892, the year Nordau's Degeneration came out, until 1992. Along with Nordau, we will focus on 2 other figures, 2 Jewish historians who took the forgotten Nordau seriously in the 20th century and made him a key component in their interpretation of modern history. One of them is George Lachman Mosse. The second is Benzion Netanyahu, father of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So it is going to be a history of reception, but we will also try to say something stimulating about Jewish history, Jewish historiography, Zionism, and liberalism. Nordau, or Simon Simcha Sudfeld, the prominent Zionist thinker, novelist, journalist, physician, and cultural and literary critic, died in 1923 at the age of 74. For many years, he was considered to be one of the most important Jewish intellectuals, if not the best known to the Jewish and non-Jewish worlds who had joined the Zionist movement. However, in the last years of his life, and in the first decade after his demise, Nordau was completely forgotten, even abandoned, especially by mainstream circles within Zionism. He was perceived as too European, too bourgeois, too clean, too buttoned-up, too exilic, too anachronistic, irrelevant to the spirit of the time after the Great War. The conflict between the Arabs and the Jews turned out to be more and more violent, and Nordau's critique of art, literature, and culture was perceived as outdated and foreign, not as something that could be of any value to the new challenge of the Jews in the Near East. However, Nordau and the so-called political Zionists were enthusiastically adopted by a growing minority, the revisionist Zionists and the far right in Palestine. Zev Vladimir Jabotinsky, the leader of the revisionist movement, was seen by his followers and by himself as Herzl's and Nordau's successor. And the bourgeois respectability of some of the political Zionists, which was rejected by socialist Zionism, became a source of inspiration for the revisionists. They call it in Hebrew hadar, which can be translated as honor or majesty, and was meant to be an anti-Marxist, anti-socialist, urban alternative to the conduct and morality of the left. No one in the revisionist movement or within Zionism embraced Nordau like a young graduate student, ardent revisionist, and a journalist, later to become an historian, Benzion Netanyahu. Already in February 1931, at the age of 21, Netanyahu published a short piece in the newspaper Doar Hayom, Palestine Daily Mail, titled Lezichro shel Nordau, in remembrance of Nordau, in which he expressed his regret that the Zionist thinker was forgotten, especially when, quote, the major content of his work is still relevant today, and the flaws that he discovered or emphasized their existence in the various parts of the human organism were verified even more in the period of destruction and war and in the years that followed. What set Nordau's idea apart from the ideas of other moral warriors was the scientific value that he attached to morality. To him, morality was a form of mental health that science emphatically demanded. He fought for morality in the name of science, in the name of objective truth only. It was a prophetic burst of fire in the cold fields of positive science, unquote. Netanyahu's Nordau was endowed with prophetic virtues and was recruited to the battle against socialism at a time when, quote, the spread of revolutionary socialism, the emergence of which Nordau battled, and the tendency toward irrational element currently taking over the science of the mind may provide a partial explanation for the disappearance from memory of Nordau, whom Lombroso held to be the genius, with capital letters, unquote. And mentioning Lombroso, who wrote a book titled The Man of Genius in 1889, is of course not accidental. In contrast to all the writers, Nietzsche, Zola, Wilde, Ibsen, and others, that were accused by him of moral degeneration, Nordau believed in contemporary science and morality, in progress, in willpower, in discipline, in hard work, order, and duty, and especially in psychology that was based on the doctrine of the physician and criminologist Cesare Lombroso, to whom he dedicated degeneration. That was in 1931. A few years later, between 1936 and 1938, a series of 6 books was published by a new independent publishing house in Palestine called Hotzaa Medinit, Political Publishing. The 6 books were the Zionist writings of Nordau in 2 volumes, Herzl in 2 volumes, Israel Zangwill, the prime thinker behind the territorial movement, and the historian Joseph Klausner. Netanyahu, the publisher, edited them and wrote short prefaces to most of them. He read them through revisionist lenses and tried to revive their thought in the 1930s. And while conjuring them up, Netanyahu threw away in his interpretation any surplus liberal baggage, recreating them in his own image. For example, in the prefaces to Nordau's writings, Netanyahu turned the author of Degeneration and Paradoxes into an ardent fighter for the establishment of a Jewish army and Eretz Yisrael Hashlema, the Greater Israel. Quote, Nordau was no unrealistic pacifist. Instead of relinquishing Transjordan, he called for an insistent, uncompromising position that would preserve the historical borders of the land. Instead of a class struggle, he called for class cooperation. Instead of a fake pacifism and reliance upon Britain military forces, he called for the establishment of a Jewish defense army, unquote. In the next decades, Netanyahu didn't change his worldviews. On the contrary, he kept on writing about his Zionist heroes, Herzl, Leon Pinsker, Zangwill, Klausner, Jabotinsky, and Nordau, while his reading of these thinkers blended with his new studies, his dissertation on the 15th century Jewish philosopher and statesman Don Isaac Abarbanel, and his studies of Jewish history during the Inquisition. In 1943, Netanyahu wrote an introduction to the English translations of Nordau's Zionist writings, and in 1954, he wrote an introduction to a new Hebrew edition of Nordau's Zionist writings, this time published after the establishment of the State of Israel. It seems that Nordau, at least in Hebrew, was revived only due to his Zionist writings. However, in 1968, an English edition of Degeneration was published, restoring him as an important symbol of 19th century cultural and intellectual history. The most important historian for placing Nordau at the eye of Fin de Siècle storm and almost liberating him from the shackles of his Zionist writings was George Mosse, who wrote an important introduction to the book written a couple of years earlier in 1966. For Mosse, Nordau was an important link in the chain, connecting his interest in the crisis of German ideology with his interest in nationalism and sexuality, or the image of man, as it was created in the 18th and 19th centuries. In Mosse's introduction, Nordau becomes a distinct representative of the way the bourgeoisie drew the lines of respectability, determining who is morally healthy and who is morally ill, who is an insider and who is an outsider, who is ugly and who is beautiful, who is clean and who is dirty, who is a real man and who is behaving in unmanly fashion, who is normal and who is abnormal. Degeneration, another of Nordau's writings, embodied an archetype of manhood and masculinity based on self-discipline, a sense of duty, honor, internalizing Nordau's psychology, and attaching the physical with the spiritual and morality, emphasizing sport, or more exactly athletics and gymnastics, internalizing Jewish stereotypes, and calling for the emergence of a new Jew, a new Jewishness, muscular Judaism. "25 years after the republication of Degeneration, Mosse wrote another article on Nordau, titled Nordau, Liberalism, and the New Jew. In the introduction to Degeneration, Mosse is mostly critical toward Nordau's bourgeois worldviews, but in the new article, Mosse defends Nordau's liberal Zionism, especially from the way it was received and embraced by revisionist Zionism and its successor. Quote, "To be sure, Nordau's new Jew was a fighting Jew, but his achievement lay not on the field of battle, but in his physical development and in putting down roots, thus recapturing his dignity. Jabotinsky's and the revisionist new Jew was similar to Max Nordau's in appearance and comportment, except for his glorification of military values. But this distinction is important, for the revisionists were up to raise physical force almost to value in and of itself. Jabotinsky thought liberalism is irrelevant in a world ruled by the struggle for survival. Nordau's liberalism mitigated any aggressiveness on the part of the new Jew, who was, after all, also a man of action. Here, liberalism meant regard for the individual, even though this individual voluntarily identified himself with the group," unquote. Thus, according to Mosse, Nordau called for the creation of a new Jew, but this Jew was supposed to be good bourgeois, not a nationalist or militarist. Muscular Judaism and Nordau's concept of manhood were supposed to dwell in a liberal world, rejecting any call for organic or folkish development of a nation and distancing himself from any expression of aggression or militarism. In the article, Mosse refers to Nordau's Zionist writings, but he mentioned the German edition from 1909, not the English translation from 1943, nor Netanyahu's introduction. Both Mosse and Netanyahu shared an interest in Nordau, but a direct intellectual confrontation or debate never took place. Instead, they wrote two contrasting monologues that in retrospect represent a struggle between an ambivalent, skeptical, liberal Zionist who found his home outside of Israel and shaped the field of modern European history, and a far-right Zionist who came back to Israel after many years in America following the death of his elder son Yoni in the Entebbe operation in 1976, and eventually shaped Israel by proxy of his second son Benjamin in the 21st century. Mosse wanted to show that Zionism in general and Nordau's vision in particular are essentially optimistic. In contrast, Netanyahu understood degeneration as an inseparable part of the pessimistic decline of the West. Mosse wanted to detach the bond between Nordau and the revisionist Zionists. In contrast, Netanyahu claimed that there is a natural connection between Nordau's vision and militarism and the Greater Israel revisionist ideal. Mosse claimed that Nordau disappeared because his rational world was no longer relevant amid the chaos after the Great War. In contrast, Netanyahu revived Nordau and thought that Nordau's worldviews symbolized the Zionist ideal, a 19th century concept of rationality in a 20th century chaotic world, as a moral or political cure in times of catastrophe, in times of crisis. Both historians needed Nordau. For Mosse, Nordau was the embodiment of undecycled bourgeois, heterosexual bourgeois world. Nordau served as the glue between the crisis of German ideology and the image of man, as one of the builders of the wall, separating the insiders and the outsiders. Mosse was an outsider. Netanyahu was an outsider as well, but a different kind of outsider, who lived most of his life at the margins of Zionist politics and the academic world, full of resentment toward the mainstream Zionist establishment, liberalism, and the left. Nordau, a liberal of the 19th century, was for him a source of inspiration for adopting a neoconservative stand in the 20th century. As mentioned, in the introduction to Degeneration, Mosse wrote that, quote, Nordau had been atypical of his age, and when that age died, he died with it, unquote. However, Mosse's and Netanyahu's writings prove that this statement is inaccurate. Nordau indeed died and was forgotten, but he was also resurrected in several metamorphoses. He became, in Netanyahu's interpretation, one of the ideological fathers of the right wing in the land of Israel. He became, in Mosse's interpretation, one of the founding fathers of respectability. Mosse might have depicted Nordau more accurately, paying attention to contradiction, complexities, nuances, and context. However, politically, Netanyahu's Zionism, which is based on his understanding of Nordau, changed Nordau's reception and turned to be more influential, especially more influential than Mosse's distant and blurred Zionism. Mosse had many students. Many of them are taking part in this impressive conference. Netanyahu didn't have many students. One of them, Norman Roth, taught for many years at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Mosse's city and home. However, Netanyahu had one other student, a follower, who is also his son. And the son, in the name of the father, is Allah's influence in the history that is still being written and will be written in the future more than all of the historians who are sitting here together. Thank you.